Phlogiston is Tevat's primordial form of energy. The heavenly principles used phlogiston as a basis for the creation of elemental energy, to develop a power to better counter the abyss. Have you heard of the concepts of the light realm and the human realm? That explanation might take too long. Light refracts into 7 different colors, which we collectively refer to as a rainbow. Elemental energy is a similar concept. It's essentially the modern counterpart of phlogiston.
Of all the incredible bits of lore that we were given in Chapter 5, I did not expect this offhanded comment from the Lord of the Night to be the one thing that monopolized my attention. But it's not because what she said felt wrong or like a retcon or anything like that. It's because this confirmation of hers made so many disparate pieces of the Tevat puzzle suddenly click into place. Like, elemental energy really is light. Dragons really are light-based beings, and Hoyo really wants us to take the whole 3 realms thing that we learned about in Enkanomiya literally. And I finally understand why both elemental energy and memories flow within the ley lines. And yes, we got all of that from like 3 lines. And in light of all these realizations, let me apologize for unknowingly spreading some misinformation about Phlogiston and the Primordial Sea. I had made the assumption that Phlogiston was like a primordial version of pyro energy, the same way I assumed the Primordial Sea was a primordial version of hydro energy. And that's not quite what's happening here. Rather than saying they are primordial versions of pyro and hydro, it's more accurate to say that they're the primordial forces that are behaving like pyro and hydro. Now, obviously, we're going to be talking about these primordial forces at length today, but there's more to this video than just mechanics. Cause see, the way these primordial forces behave and interact with each other tells us a lot about that thing we saw beyond the false sky, the cosmic horrors that linger just beyond the firmament. So we're going to talk about that today too. And with those expectations set, don't forget you can find everything you need, including timestamps, spoiler warnings, and citations in the description box, while post video notes and corrections will be in the pinned comment. Then without further ado, let's dive right into it. When the Lord of the Night talks about the Phlogiston in Chapter 5, Act 4, she implies that the current elemental system was derived from it, and then tries to explain what she means by that by referencing the light realm, as well as some basic physics behind the visible light spectrum. Now, the basic idea here is that Phlogiston is a source of light that was split into 7 colors, which we call the elements. And yeah, okay, cool, I can get behind that. It makes sense. I mean, Phlogiston possesses a near rainbow of colors within it, and it also expresses the properties of fire, and fire emits light. And this idea of elements being related to the colors of light didn't just spawn randomly in Natlan. The game's been hinting at this for years. Now, I was totally on board with this explanation of the Lord of the Nights until I remembered the existence of the Primordial Sea, because I couldn't really figure out where it factored into everything. Like, we know that all life into that comes from the Primordial Sea, but if the world itself is made of elements, which is something else that we know is true, and all the elements are made out of phlogiston, then the Primordial Sea either has to be hydro and therefore also part of phlogiston, which I couldn't really see happening, or the Primordial Sea was something else entirely, a sort of counterbalance to the elements. And that's when things clicked. If phlogiston is elemental energy, then its counterbalance, the Primordial Sea, might be the source of memories. The thing about elemental energy is that it contains no will of its own, because as I said in my last theory, elements are the building blocks of the world and are thus meant to carry the will of the one who uses them. This is one of the reasons why phlogiston is so closely associated with ink. One's will is conveyed through words that are then written in phlogiston ink, and that manifests itself into reality. This is basically how the dragon's iridescent inscriptions worked. The inscriptions are the will and words that manipulate the phlogiston ink, and that ink is then shaped into the world around you. In contrast, the Primordial Sea is associated with all things related to emotions, memory, and a sense of self. Think back on the themes of Fontaine, for example. The Primordial Sea could melt people down and merge their minds into one formless mass. The Primordial Sea is essentially then a sea of consciousness. It doesn't actually possess any elemental properties, it's just that its behavior is most most closely associated to that of water. In this way, all life can still rise from the primordial sea as it enters a body made of the elements. And this is where things get a little bit interesting, because the primordial sea is a reference to the primordial waters, which is actually a very common aspect of many cosmologies, where it's often referred to as the cosmic ocean and describes the universe as it was before creation began. Now, in my last video, I made the case that the Abyss is Genshin's version of the primordial chaos, or this cosmic ocean, on the basis that every Hoyoverse game features a primordial sea of chaos from which a tree of order grows. And according to the description of the Mimiflora Abyss monster, Teyvat is described as a tree-like world, which makes sense in context, given that it's built around the world tree Irminsul. But the most important part of this argument is that everything, including the tree of order, is supposed to be constructed from this chaos material, and that should, by all accounts, include Phlogiston and the primordial sea. But what's funny is that the cosmic ocean can apparently be personified as either water or as a mixture of water and fire. Now, do you see where I'm going with all this? Because I'm basically implying that the Abyss is made of Phlogiston and primordial seawater mixed together in one formless, shapeless, chaotic mass. Now, Irminsul's roots are implied to reach all the way down into the Abyss, and I think that the tree itself is almost like a processing plant. It takes up small amounts of raw chaos matter and splits it into phlogiston and primordial seawater, which we've been calling elemental energy and memories this entire time. And that's why elemental energy and memories flow within the ley lines together, and why the two of them are somewhat interchangeable at times. They're both two parts of the same thing. They're made of the same stuff. Now, this is a perfect example of the philosophical theory of the unity of opposites. This theory suggests that every element of the material world comes in equal but opposite pairs. For the purposes of this theory, we're mostly looking at the elements of fire and water. According to the philosopher Anaximander and his students, these paired elements made up the material world, and together they rose from the Apeiron, or Arche, which is basically the philosophical counterpart to the cosmic sea or the primordial chaos. The philosopher Heraclitus expanded on this idea and declared that the Arche was actually something more like the divine law of the universe, which he would then call the Logos. And in Genshin, the Logos is synonymous with the power of will, divine law, and in some cases the heavenly principles. So you can kind of see where I'm going with this because it connects directly to the Traveler and why they're going to be able to ascend to the seat of God. But Heraclitus thought of this union of opposites differently than Anaximander did. Rather than say that these opposite pairings are two separate substances, Heraclitus believed that the universe was in a constant state of flux and change and transformation, and thus any opposite pairings were simply the same concept but at two different states in this fluctuating transitional process. Take the concept of hot and cold, for example. Things that are cold will eventually become hot, and things that are hot will eventually become cold. But both things are together the unified concept of temperature, and temperature fluctuates. And this is the same thought process behind phlogiston and the primordial sea. While they are opposite and equal forces, they are also interchangeable to a degree, and together they make up the Arche, the Logos of the universe, which for our purposes is synonymous with the Abyss. Which brings me, of course, to dragon babies. Because why the heck not? Okay, so at their core, dragons seem to be elemental creatures. And elements are split from phlogiston, and phlogiston is kind of like a primordial fire, and primordial fire alongside primordial water are two things that can be split from the cosmic ocean, aka the Abyss. So what happens when a crazy alchemist tries to make a dragon from unprocessed abyssal goo? Well, you'd get a Durin or an Elenus. I want to focus on Elenus right here, though, for reasons which you're going to understand in a second. When you meet him for the first time, Elenus tells you about how he was born. Basically, he was floating in the cosmic darkness until Rhine-daughter called him forth and helped him to be born in a beautiful world underground, away from the cosmic darkness. He later then died in Fontaine during the Conrian Cataclysm, and his body entered a kind of dormant state. That is, until Renee came along. I'm not going to rehash the events of the Narzissenkreuz questline too much here, but basically, because of him, there was a big old fight inside of Elenus' dormant body, and it involved some explosions and an Oceanid that managed to merge with a human. Now, Elenus describes this Oceanid, whose name is Lyris, as a spirit of the primordial waters, which makes sense because Oceanids are full of primordial seawater, and this is where things get a bit risque, I guess? Because this explosion is also what caused the Melazines to be born from the flesh of Elenus. Now, it is strongly implied that these little tadpoles here are the spirits of Melazines, and I can't help but notice two things about them. First off, they're sperm-shaped, and secondly, they are pyro-colored. And I think both the coloring and the properties of these little dragon spermies have something to do with the properties of Elenis's heart, which they fly around. Now, Elenis is a sibling of Durin. Both were created by the same person in the same way, so we need to assume that their bodies have similar properties. So Durin's heart emits a lot of heat, enough to warm an entire cave in Dragonspine. And that feels like a nod to the Phlogiston's fire-like properties, which basically means we have Phlogiston sperm. And if you have Phlogiston sperm and the opposite of Phlogiston is a primordial sea, then you should have primordial sea eggs somewhere. See where I'm going with this? Yeah, I'm kind of side-eyeing Nouvelette's source water droplets a bit now because they have little bits of DNA inside. And he also controls the primordial sea. And a spirit of the primordial waters, which is Lyris, was present for the birth of the Melazines, and she has the primordial sea water inside of her. And I'm kind of wondering at this point if somehow Lyris and Elenis mixed their phlogiston and seawater together accidentally. And that's how Melazines were born. And I feel like this process also works for life forms like Vishops, who aren't necessarily elemental creatures in the way that slimes are, while still having strong elemental affinities and a pretty close connection to water. Because the interesting thing about most of the dragons is that a lot of them are based off of deep sea creatures, especially sea slugs. And Melazines are based off of nudibranchs, which are a type of sea slug. And you know what else is based off of a sea slug? Sealies. Well, I guess I can call them angels now, which is fitting because these things are based off of Cleones, or sea angels. And the neat thing about these seelie angels is that, just like their biblical counterparts, angels do not have physical bodies. Their bodies were supposedly made of light or fire in biblical times. And because of all of this, I'm of the opinion right now, at least, that sealies and dragons are related species, but are at perhaps different stages of evolution. Because it's strongly implied that the creator of the sealies, or at least the Lord of the Night and her friends, is the first descender, also known as the Heavenly Principles or the Primordial One. So for dragons and sealies to be related, the first descender also kind of has to be of draconic lineage, which I think is plausible, actually. Because the fourth descender, the Traveler, looks just like Biblical Angel at the start of the game before their powers are taken, and they can naturally use every element into that, including the source of all elements, the Phlogiston. In fact, the Traveler's ascension material might be made out of Phlogiston. I mean, the coloring is identical to the Sacred Flame and Phlogiston, and since Phlogiston is the source of all elements, that could be a nod to why the Traveler can use all of the elements. They might just be made of pure Phlogiston, like the dragons. And perhaps that's also why they're called the Chosen of Dragons, and why each of their elemental kits resemble the abilities of the dragons that govern said element. And come to think of it, if dragons really are made of phlogiston, then suddenly it makes sense why Nahida would try to save the Dendro dragon using a fire seed. It was probably full of phlogiston. Now, the Traveler is also frequently represented by and referred to as a star, specifically the morning or evening star, which is technically a planet, but we're going to ignore that fact for the time being because phlogiston might just be what makes up a star, metaphorically at least. Because, stars are basically just huge balls of superheated plasma and gases that emit constant light, and they create raw elements through nuclear fusion, and those raw elements then make up physical matter as we know it, hence why everything is said to be made of stardust, just like how everything into that is made of the elements. Now, important to note, the morning star or Venus is most frequently associated with Lucifer, whose name means Lightbringer, and Lucifer was a fallen angel who tried to fight God and failed. Now, in-game, it seems like he's being referred to as Hesperus and Phosphorus based on achievements that you get in Enkanomiya. But Enkanomiya is also where we learn of a potential name for the first descender, Phanes. Now, Phanes is fun here because he was a god of creation whose body was made entirely of light, or maybe phlogiston. But in some Orphic Genesis myths, Phanes was actually born of a cosmic egg that was conceived by the primordial serpent gods Kronos Ion, whose name means time, and Ananke, whose name means fate or inevitability. So what if you looked at these two primordial serpent gods, who themselves manifested from raw chaos, and assigned them the roles of primordial fire and primordial water, progenitors of phlogiston and primordial seawater? Well, then it's possible that Phanes was the offspring of dragons, different in form and function but related nonetheless, and Phanes eventually came to rule the human realm, since that's one of the proposed names for the first descender. But the human realm is only one of 3 realms. In her explanation of phlogiston and the elements, the Lord of the Night mentions the light realm, which is one of the 3 realms of reality, which is something that we only ever learn about in Enkanomiya. Those 3 realms are the light realm, human realm, and void realm. The human realm is pretty self-explanatory. This is basically Tevat. The void realm should be the abyss. And the light realm is also known as the elemental realm or the bishop realm because that's presumably where the dragons as a whole species come from. Now, the light and void realms seem to have their own types of energies that flow in currents that then seem to mix in the human realm's ley lines. My hypothesis is that the seawater flows in from the void realm currents and the phlogiston flows in from the light realm currents. They then mix in the roots of Irminsul and thus act like, sperm and eggs that allow the world to be in a constant state of creation. And this is once again based on the Orphic creation myth I just mentioned, because when Kronos Ion and Ananke hatched the cosmic egg, it split into the 3 realms of heaven, earth, and the sea. Now this myth is talked about at length in Plato's Republic, where he goes on to describe what this freshly created world looks like. He claims that the heaven is represented by a box which contains the 7 orbits of the planets and stars suspended from the axis or spindle of Ananke that generates the music of the spheres. Now, heaven, earth, and sea easily correspond to the light, human, and void realms of Genshin respectively. And since heaven in this model is represented by the orderly box, which we've come to associate with the orderly light dragons, I'm going to postulate that Nibelung is playing the role of Kronos Ion here, especially since Nuvalet refers to him as the Heavenly Father in his voice lines. Ananke, therefore, should be the ruler of the sea or the void realm. Now, this connection may not be obvious at first, but Ananke is the mother of the Morai, also known as the 3 Fates, and in Genshin, fate is associated primarily with the stars at night, and the night sky was governed by the 3 moon sisters, and the moons are closely associated with water. Maybe because in the real world the moon influences the tides, but they're also associated with songs because Genshin named the moons after 3 types of songs: arias, sonatas, and canons. As for the human realm, nestled tightly between heaven and the sea, we are left with the one who is said to have hatched from the cosmic egg, Phanes. And based on what it says in Before Sun and Moon, we can only assume that Phanes is ruling the earthly realm. Now, because the elements themselves have been likened to light, this setup here reminds me a bit of the electromagnetic spectrum. And if this assessment is correct, then off to one side, we're gonna have the invisible infrared, which represents the light realm, and on the opposite end of the spectrum, we're going to have ultraviolet, which represents the abyss. The space between these 2 points would therefore be the visible light spectrum that makes up the human realm, the realm of elements. Now, for this rainbow to appear, though, raw light's going to need to be split, and I think that this was probably a bit of an iterative process over time by multiple individuals. Like, I think the dragons started the process of splitting light, and then the heavenly principles refined it later on. And the reason I say that is because there are 7 dragon sovereigns and 7 elements, and the dragon sovereigns are elemental in nature, and they're the ones who had the original authorities over the elements and all of that kind of stuff. So I think it's pretty safe to assume that the concept of phlogiston being split into multiple parts like elements had its roots in the era of dragons. However, the Lord of the Night speaks of a modern system of elements, which means that there is a difference between the elements of dragons and the elements we're familiar with. And because the Lord of the Night spoke of the 3 realms, which again was only ever talked about in Enkanomiya, I was reminded of the 3 Realms Gateway offering event, which had these little guys, the Sanga Corellia. These little guys are unique crystal flies whose job was to, quote, break down raw primitive elemental energy into the mild elemental energy of the human realm. They're also called the Destroyers of the Old Order, wherein the Old Order should refer to the era of dragons. But this also means that elemental energy existed back during the era of dragons, so all these crystal flies should be doing is further refining the elements so that they are safer for humans. Now, I think it's this refining process that was developed by the current heavenly principles in order to help maintain a balance between both ends of the spectrum, because while we always hear about the dangers of abyssal energy, we do have to recognize that raw elemental energy was also harmful to humans, just in different ways. Okay, so the light realm is the closest to the color of red, which is related to pyro, which is related to phlogiston. That checks out, pretty simple, right? So if we go to the opposite side for the void realm, we should have blue for hydro and the primordial sea. But that's not the case, that's not blue, that's violet, and violet isn't hydro, it's electro. So hold on, why is the abyss related to electro when I've just spent the entire video talking about how it's like water? Well, you see, the game's playing a bit of a trick on you. See, both ends of the spectrum require an element that can emit light. And apart from pyro, the only element that can emit light is electro. And if you're wondering why this is, it's because Teyvat, the human realm, is made of elements, and elements are the visible light spectrum. And the light and void realm energies exist beyond the visible spectrum. So in order to enter the visible spectrum, they're going to need a means by which to project themselves onto this human realm, and that requires a source of light that is closest to its own natural wavelength. For the light realm, this is going to be fire or pyro because that's closest to its wavelength. And for the void realm, this is going to be electro or lightning because that's closest to its wavelength. Now, these different kinds of lights are then going to have to pass through their own types of prisms that behave like the next wavelength's associated element. In the case of pyro, this is geo. For electro, this is hydro. Geo and hydro, therefore, are the elements that represent the means by which light is carried, split, or otherwise manipulated. Now, earlier in this video, I pointed out that the primordial sea is really like a sea of consciousness, and this very much fits with having a close relationship to the light of electro, because according to the Wings of the Forest, all mortal thought is the work of electricity. That's not even a lie because, electrical signals in the brain and all that. So, okay, that leaves us with phlogiston being a hot substance related to stars that are known for creating the elements that make up all physical matter, and primordial seawater being an electrically conductive material that hosts the thoughts represented by electro. In this way, they are the elemental energy and memories that flow within the ley lines, and the best part is that the ley lines are the roots of Irminsul, and Irminsul is the root of Dendro power, and Dendro is green, and green is right smack dab in the middle of the visible light spectrum. Although, if everything in the world is light-based, then Irminsul's ley line system is basically like a complex series of fiber optic cables. And fiber optic cables are basically long strings of flexible coated glass that carry data that's been optically encoded via bouncing light refractions. So I think fiber optics are actually quite fitting of a metaphor here, because inside of Irminsul is very digital, right down to this pattern on it, which resembles the patterns of a microchip. Now, these patterns are actually made through a process called photolithography, wherein light is used to transfer a pattern onto a silicate substrate coated in layers of conductive materials, and that material is what we call a circuit. And what's neat about this is that this light-based etching is done with ultraviolet light, which in Genshin should be electro-related. And since electro is related to thoughts, then basically thoughts are getting encoded onto Irminsul, and Irminsul is a record of the memory of the world, which would mean that the memory of the world is encoded with, quote, abyssal light, which also might be why new ley lines can only be laid down by abyss-like powers, like the Loom of Fate, or perhaps forbidden knowledge. And oh boy, that means it's time to go down to Deshret Town, because Deshret's one of the only other places you're going to find this Irminsul circuit board-like pattern. A lot of Deshret's technology displays this circuit-like pattern, which is very appropriate because Deshret was kind of obsessed with the behavior of light. In fact, all of his technology is light-based. Even some of his buildings seem as though they are constructed entirely out of light, which actually isn't too far-fetched of a possibility because there are actually devices in his facilities, namely the forged primal lights and the replicator keystones, that will create real physical devices out of nothing but light. Now, the reason I'm honing in on this is because in many ways he seems to have been studying the core functions behind how the world works, specifically draconic technology, the Phlogiston, and Irminsul. And also technically the Abyss, because he went through that whole forbidden knowledge phase. But just to give you an example, take his automatons, right? They're quite similar to the secret source automatons of the dragons, but instead of running on Phlogiston-powered cores, they use a light-bending prism that looks identical to a crystal fly core. This kind of matters because in Breeze Amidst the Forest, there's a footnote that draws a connection between elemental energy ascending to become a crystal fly or descending to become a slime. And then it connects this process to the birth of an elemental dragon. And I find that very interesting because these crystal flies possess solid crystal prisms, which we've been connecting to dragon technology and phlogiston, while slimes are kind of these formless, gooey masses, kind of like the hydro eidolons and tulpas I've been associating with the primordial sea, which should be more closely related to the abyss, right? And allegedly, these automatons of his are technically powered by the souls of the jinn that are trapped inside of them, and those jinn, as we established earlier, should be beings made of light, phlogiston. And better still, throughout his ruins, you'll run into these blue primal embers, which then light primal torches with primal flames. And this stuff seems to power his facilities, which is very interesting because primal fire is another name for the sacred flame of Natlan, which is lit with phlogiston. And come to think of it, if he really was studying the source of all elements in the phlogiston and Irminsul, then that could be why he was called the master of all the elements. Now keep this in mind as we go a little bit deeper into the desert, because that's where we're gonna find a little place called the Valerium Mirage. Now this place was a little bottled world run by an oceanid, and its name sums up its core function pretty nicely. Valerium is a reference to the stone lapis lazuli, and a mirage is an illusion made of light. So basically it's a world of light bent through a lapis lazuli prism, or perhaps a hydro prism, because the hydro gemstone is called lazurite, which is a core component of lapis lazuli. Now I'm calling this gemstone a prism because the world of Bottleland is made entirely based on projections of light. Essentially, light is passed through these hydro streaming projectors, which then display shadowed shapes on a flat surface. These shapes are called preprints and are basically like blueprints from which physical objects can be constructed. And actually, this could be a part of the photolithography process where you mask the area that you don't want to get etched into the circuit. It kind of means that these shadow projections are defining the negative space. Now you remember how I called hydro the prism through which abyssal light is bent so that the abyss can manifest into the material realm just like the dragons do? Well, the reason I said that is because, you know that thing that appeared in the sky during the war with Natlan? Well, those abyssal tumors that it dropped are eerily similar to the streaming projectors. They've got that same orb-shaped prism and a wooden ley line-looking base. And these abyssal projectors seem to be using Teyvat itself as a preprint or a blueprint from which it creates abyss-flavored copies of things. Now, what I find even more interesting about this is that the precursors to the abyssal projectors are these abyssal pylons, which resemble mirrors that reflect light. In fact, this mimetic behavior might play a role in why the abyss is called clever or sentient, but not necessarily intelligent. It's only mirroring things that already exist. And that also makes water the perfect element to compare the abyss to, because the power of water is the power to take any shape. And, you know, water is very mimic-based in Genshin. So water and the abyss sharing the ability to take any shape and mimic things through imagination reminded me of Nahida's second story quest where Apep's fragments shared with her the secrets of evolution, which allowed them to change their shape if given enough time. Now you only ever hear about evolution in game when the topic of dragons come up. Bethismal bishops evolved different elemental affinities depending on their environment, and both Apep and Neuvillette boast DNA strands in their visuals, implying a relationship to genetics. Neuvillette also mentions that this evolutionary adaptability is especially strong with the Bethismal bishops because they have a very close relationship with the primordial sea. Now I've just spent the last however long it's been relating the primordial sea to the powers of the abyss, and coincidentally, the only other creatures that are said to evolve are the abysslings. And this is easiest to see with the iniquitous Baptist, who is called the Baptist of Great Sin in Chinese. Their description reads, a creature of the abyss that, through the dark Stygian powers, has gained additional appendages via evolution. So he's basically a sinner, likely a former human, who used the power of the abyss to evolve. Now, where have I heard something like that before? Oh yeah, it's one of Sumeru Academia's 6 cardinal sins. Thou shalt not interfere with human evolution. Now this is a particularly interesting connection because it implies that humans are not permitted to evolve on their own and that the abyss plays a role in the evolutionary process. And it kind of reminds me of the role that random genetic mutations play in nature. I mean, there's no evolution without a level of randomness or errors that pop up in a genetic sequence, right? And this makes me think that whoever's in charge of Teyvat does not want these mutations. So the thing that brings them, the abyss, is forced outside, and its inert derivative, the primordial sea, is carefully regulated, and those who use it for their own purposes, like Egeria did, are harshly punished. But I'm also starting to think that the presence of the abyss is actually a necessary one, and that there's a reason why the Traveler's sibling and Conria's sinners are so invested in learning more about it, and it's not just about fate. So it's finally time to talk about what's actually lurking just outside the firmament, and we're gonna do that with the help of the lore community's favorite little damage sponge, Child. Some context before we start talking about this spicy little ginger snap. That thing in the sky is presumably the heart of the abyss, and it boasts the name Go-Soithoth, which is an anagram for the Lovecraftian creature Yog-Sothoth, one of the outer gods that exists outside of space-time and who generally takes the shape of eyeballs and tendrils. And that matches the designs of the abyssal projector tumor things, which are similar to the hydro projectors in Bottleland. Once again, this relationship between water and the abyss rears its ugly head, as we also have a hydro dragon serving the role as the heart of the primordial sea, similar to the heart of the abyss. Now, curiously, this dragon, Nuvolette, boasts triquetra imagery, which is a little rare for a dragon because they're mostly cubic, design-wise. But I am starting to wonder if the triquetra is actually a symbol of the abyss, because the heart of the abyss takes on a triquetra-like appearance. And then we have Child, who has strong abyssal ties and who also uses the triquetra for his riptide sigil. And these shapes remind me of those curious defense mechanisms in Dragonspine, and seeing how elemental dragons at least had space-age technology, I don't think it's unreasonable to presume that this technology could have belonged to a watery faction of dragons. Other pieces of this era's technology have more cubic design patterns, which more closely relate to the quaternary knot, which is boxy, which is related to the elemental light dragons. So maybe it's like the quaternary knot is closer to the phlogiston side of things, while the triquetra is closer to the primordial seawater and or abyssal side of things. But this would create a rather interesting connection between dragons and Lovecraftian horrors. And you know what? There's actually a precedence in Lovecraftian mythos for this hypothesis to be correct, like for there to be Lovecraftian dragons. While they're not created by Lovecraft himself, which is not uncommon by the way, as the mythos has grown far beyond his original works, there exists the race of the Tatsu. And the Tatsu are serpentine, elemental, and celestial dragons that are basically forces of nature made manifest. The ones who live on Earth are split into two types, the Kazutsuchi, who have power over fire, and the Watatsumi, who have power over water. Now that should be a pretty familiar word for a lot of you because we've got Watatsumi Island, which is home to the sleeping dragon and which takes the shape of a watery sleeping dragon. Now these Tatsu are the guardians of the Earth and, get this, their domains are built from their life forces and they crisscross the planet in a massive energy grid that are known as dragon paths in the east, or alternatively in the west, ley lines. And it just so happens that what flows into Vat's ley lines is a mix of elemental energy and memories, which are derivatives of their more primordial forms, phlogiston and primordial seawater, fire and water. Two opposite ends of a spectrum. And once again, if we relate this back to our Orphic creation myth, we have Kronos Ion on one side and Ananke on the other. If Kronos Ion is Nibelung's equivalent and is also the heavenly father and the master of the phlogiston or the light, then the Ananke equivalent should be the master of the water or the darkness, the night mother. And speaking of a mother dragon of darkness, the progenitor of the Tatsu appears to be the mother of all serpents, the great dragon Mappo, who will apparently destroy the world by swallowing the sun because she does not like the fact that humans are mixing blood with dragon kind. You remember how I said that genetic mutations and evolution were the domain of the abyss? Yeah, this is kind of related to that. Incidentally, Mappo is currently sealed underground and sleeping due to the power of an 8-pointed star, and in Teyvat, the ones who are united under the banner of an 8-pointed star and who had contact with a Lord of Darkness is the people of Khaenri'ah. Now, the book Paraneri takes place in Khaenri'ah, and it also has the most peculiar description of Khaenri'ah's crimson moon, as it claims that this moon is actually one enormous horrified-looking eye. This moon is most likely a reference to the Lovecraftian entity known as Groth, a giant reddish moon-like eye made of ash and gas that wanders the cosmos singing the music of the spheres. If there are any ancient deities on a planet that it gets too close to, then it wakes up and causes death and destruction to everything around it. And that's why it's got the nickname of the Harbinger. It's a harbinger of destruction. And there's another Lovecraftian entity mentioned later on in the book when one character speaks of one of Khaenri'ah's mightiest figures, Njord, the one who walks with the dark sprites. And this line in the book is accompanied by a canonical footnote which clarifies that the dark sprites can also be translated as black wolves, and that they appear to be some sort of war beast created with alchemy. Does that sound familiar? Because it should. The book is describing the Rift Hounds after all, and this may not be immediately apparent, but the Rift Hounds are Genshin's version of the Hounds of Tyndalos. Now you might think this one's a bit of a stretch, but there is an explicit connection that I can point to. Because when you finish defeating all of the Rift Wolves in the Beastly Rifts in Fontaine, you're gonna get the achievement Angle Eraser. And this is an explicit reference to the Hounds of Tyndalos novel, because in that book, the hounds are said to live in the quote, angles of time, while humans live in the curves of time. And there was this one guy who was so afraid of these hounds that he rounded off every corner in his house so the hounds couldn't reach him through the angles, hence the achievement Angle Eraser. The dude erased the angles. But the funny thing is, the Rift Hounds were said to have been created by one of Khaenri'ah's sinners, Rhine-Daughter. Now the fact that Rhine-Daughter, who is one of the sinners, used abyssal material to create these Lovecraftian entities, and the fact that she's known as someone who can create flowers that are not of this this world makes me think that she understands something about the process of creating new things and the process of evolution, which also makes me rethink what it means for the iniquitous Baptist to be a being that evolved through sin. But Rheindotter also brings me back to Fontaine, which is home of the Primordial Sea, because not only is the story of Paraneri referenced in Fontaine via a local legend battle, but it's also the final resting place of another one of Rheindotter's creations, Elenus, an abyssal dragon. Now, while Elenus' name isn't particularly Lovecraftian, he did die fighting against a woman named Basil Elton, the vice director of the Narzissenkreuz Institute and former Fontanian Navy officer. And Basil Elton is named after the protagonist of the Lovecraft novel The White Ship. And the connection to the Narzissenkreuz Institute is kind of important here because as you play through their questline, you're gonna stumble upon a note that talks about the ancient hero Ajax, whom Child is named after. The note starts off with the line, Io Io Pan, that which lies beneath the great sea. And a lot of people, myself included, have pointed out that this is a reference to either the Hymn to Pan by Aleister Crowley due to the line in it that reads, Io Pan, come over the sea, or it's a reference to the play Ajax by Sophocles, which has the line, Io Io Pan, o pan from the stony ridge. However, I would like to argue that this is actually a reference to the Lovecraft novel Shadow over Innsmouth and the line Ia Cthulhu Fatagan, because the note is actually talking about that which lies beneath the great sea, and in the Lovecraftian mythos, this being is Cthulhu. The full line, which I will not attempt to pronounce, seems to roughly translate into the dead Cthulhu sleeps within his house dreaming. Now, this house in question is part of an ancient city that sunk beneath the Pacific Ocean, and depending on who you ask, the people of this world are either part of Cthulhu's dream, or that Cthulhu is simply waiting for his moment of rebirth and awakening, and is just, laying at the bottom of the ocean sleeping. This is partly why Cthulhu is called the Lord of the Watery Abyss, He Who Will Rise Again, and the Sleeping God, titles that line up with the next line of the Narzissenkreuz note, quote, the purpose of this line in the ritual scripture is to forsake the self and sink into the abyss, and in the abyss to welcome rebirth as a holy infant. The note then goes on to say, quote, lies beneath the great sea is itself an interesting phrase. It comes from the ancient Sumeru texts and should be read as Narayana, which also means primordial human. Now, since Child shares a name with this ancient hero Ajax, many have also likened him to Narayana, or the primordial human, which for longtime players should be a familiar phrase because Rheindotter was working on the primordial human project, the same one that presumably produced Albedo and his abyss dragon siblings, which also suggests that this primordial aspect of the primordial human project might not be referencing like the ancient or first humans, but instead the fusion of humans with the primordial elements, which I'm wagering that in the case of Rheindotter is going to err more on the abyssal side of things. At least that's the case for Child. And this could be the reason why Child's Foul Legacy transformation has a lot in common visually with the abyss-afflicted individuals like the Hilichurls and Abysslings. And it kinda helps that the art was initially developed by Sertologi, who is, like Rheindotter, one of Conria's sinners who embraced the abyss. And it's certainly not the first time that Hoyo has used elements of Lovecraftian mythos in their games. The last time they did this was in Houkai Gakuen 2, where they made Cthulhu a planet-sized extraterrestrial monster that was gonna destroy the world, but through a series of events decided to observe it instead. Although she did blow up the moon in the process. Just side-eyeing that shattered moon there beyond the firmament in Natlan. But I'm not really gonna go into Houkai Gakuen 2 here because I'm only really using it as a thematic example. But I will point out that Cthulhu here has a very familiar symbol on her neck that, in Genshin at least, is most closely related to Deshret obtaining forbidden knowledge and Conria's banner. Both of them are associated with the abyss, and so is Cthulhu. I sense a recurring pattern here, especially since Deshret really wanted to fight heaven so mankind could be free, and he did this by digging into forbidden knowledge. And the one who protects the secrets of the universe and is called the gateway and the key to all of the secrets of the universe is the Lovecraftian entity known as Yog-Sothoth. Yeah, the heart of the abyss. He is also Cthulhu's grandfather. And with all these tightly interwoven connections, I'm starting to wonder if the secrets of the sky that Conria caught a glimpse of came about because of Yog-Sothoth, if he opened a gateway and showed them a glimpse of the truth beyond. I mean, that truth was so devastating that it caused a whole civil war that overturned the original Crimson Moon dynasty and made Conria want to fight heaven, just like Deshret. So I doubt it's a coincidence that these two share the 8-pointed star imagery, and that the doorway to Khaenri'ah is found in Deshret's territory. Especially once you realize just how much Deshret is referred to in Lovecraftian terms. Like, consider the way Kasala describes him as a terrifying deity that spreads forbidden knowledge and madness everywhere. That is textbook Lovecraftian lingo for alien gods. And sure, you could write this off as coincidental, but Deshret is the god of the dead, and within his lands is a place called the Sands of Al-Azif. The name literally means the singing sands, but did you know this is also the original name of the Necronomicon, which was also created by H.P. Lovecraft? It's also called the Book of the Dead, and history says that it was written by a madman who worshipped Yog-Sothoth and Cthulhu. And if Yog-Sothoth is the keeper of the gateway to forbidden knowledge, and Deshret tried to get forbidden knowledge and is the god of the dead, well, maybe he has a Book of the Dead too. So what do we do with this information? Where do we go from here? What is the point of me telling you all of this? Well, the point is Hoyoverse has exactly one idea of what they want to do with a story, and they just happen to know how to remix it in a bajillion different ways. And you can watch them iterate on this idea of humanity trying to fight off big unknown cosmic horrors by just following each one of their games in sequence. The latest instance of this was in Honkai Impact 3rd. And in that game, the big cosmic horror was actually trying to enter reality in order to embrace humanity, which is a process I'm not going to explain. But it was harming humanity in the process of trying to do this. So humanity saw it as a massive threat and fought it with everything that they had. Weapons, genetically modified super soldiers, you name it. But nothing could stop the cosmic horrors. Except for one little girl who decided that she would try to embrace the horror instead, and over time she was gonna work together with it and pave the way for a peaceful coexistence. No, violent resistance required. And that's kind of where I think Genshin's going to. Like, if the Phlogiston really was split into the elements in order to, quote, better counter the Abyss, then it kind of sounds as though the ruling powers of Teyvat are trying to fight the Abyss in order to eliminate it. Except the truth is that the Abyss is a necessary existence. You can't control it or suppress it indefinitely, and that's kind of the point. The more you fight it, the more it fights back. So if you don't want to fight it anymore, you have to find a way to learn to live with it. You kind of have to embrace the Abyss. And maybe that's why the Traveler's sibling and Khaenri'ah's sinners made the choices that they did. It doesn't mean that they made the right ones, mind you, but they may know something that we don't, and it might be something along these lines of the Abyss being a necessary existence. And may I remind you that Ananki's name can also mean necessity? Food for thought. Well, hey there! Thank you for watching. Can you believe the first draft of this was only like 1,200 words? I got a little carried away during my research and waffled around a lot trying to make it all work together. Funnily enough, all of the Cthulhu stuff was actually taken from my notes for a Deshret theory that I'm probably never going to get around to making at this rate, so I'm glad I finally got to put them to good use. Speaking of Deshret though, you want to see something funny while we showcase all our lovely channel members here? Well, of course you do, that's why you're still here. So okay, Genshin actually takes a ton more ideas from Houkai Gakuen, and it would take me forever to list them all, but I want to kind of highlight a couple. Like how Houkai Gakuen's Cthulhu actually became infatuated with a human who dies and then gets turned into a biocomputer whose primary function is to monitor human evolution to see if they can survive the cosmic horrors. And if they can't, then she destroys the world and resets humanity. And this computer's name is Alaya, which is actually also capable of being read as Aria. Yep, the same Aria as one of Genshin's moons. I'm sure that's not a coincidence at all. Is there a lot more to this? Yes, absolutely, but I also think that's enough tinfoil hat fun for right now. So, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting and fun, and I will catch you all in the next one. See you later.